Welcome everyone to this historic occasion. For this is the first ever online reading of the Red Dragon reading series and the first reading of the 2021 academic year. I'm Robert Benson, an English adjunct at SUNY Oneonta, former professor of English and director of writing at Hartwick College, and currently I direct the Seeing Things Poetry Workshop at Bright Hill Literary Center and Press at Treadwell, New York. I'd like to mention that if you have questions for Roger Hecht or comments, especially kind, positive comments, you're welcome to post them on the Q&A function of Teams, which you'll find at the lower right-hand corner of the toolbar. It looks like a question mark, and if you scroll over, it says Show Q&A. You click on that, and you can post a question which Roger Hecht can see and will take up after his reading. I'd like to thank a few people. I want to thank you for coming out and braving Teams in this early fall date. And I want to thank also Ms. Ruth Carr, who is our administrative assistant in English, for making the technical side of this operation work. In math, they like you to show your work. In public performance, not so much. You're supposed to make it look easy. Ruth makes it look easy. But if we showed the work, there'd be a good 4 or 5 hours of practice meetings and consultations to get us to the point where we can have a few minutes with you in this way. And we want to appreciate Ruth for doing that for us. She's our invisible producer. Thanks too to the Red Dragon Reading Series team of Dr. Suzanne Black, the head of the English department, Dr. George Hovis, Dr. Dan Payne, all professors of English, and to our poet tonight, Dr. Roger Hecht, who will momentarily populate your screen. Dr. Hecht came to SUNY Oneonta 14 years ago, having graduated in reverse order, Syracuse University, the University of Arizona, and the University of Maryland at College Park. First as an English major, then as an MFA in creative writing, and finally as a PhD in 19th century American literature, which are his areas of special teaching and research, along with environmental literature and modern and postmodern poetry, literary and critical theory, and Japanese animated film. He's working on the films of Miyazaki and Takahata even now. But the hat he's wearing tonight virtually is his first and main love, and that is that of the art and craft of poetry, which, judging from his published works, which have appeared in a mighty stream since 1988, have yielded so far 3 books of his own poems and editions of literature, the Erie Canal Reader and Songs of the Anti-Rent Movement, a book called Freeman Awake. His poetry in journals is voluminous, and that collected in his recent books, Talking Pictures and Witness Report especially, have driven reviewers to the extremes of their resources to do justice to their enthusiasm. Michael Martone wrote that Hecht's collection, quote, collects all right, is stuffed with stuff. The things collected there have a thing for thingness. It's as if Hecht has constructed an elaborate yet elegant filter that slows the speed of light, turning it into a rich syrup, a saturated plasma, and gorgeous chunks of heretofore unknown matter materialize out of the either or ether. Picture that. Closer to my level of understanding, Michael Burkhart talks about Hecht drawing us in to have a look and then take us elsewhere, places comic and heroic with keen senses of tempo and tone. Observing the same dynamic more darkly in Witness Report, Bertha Rogers calls the book a little book of horrors. She says the poems begin as benign and soon swerve into violence and despair, for which I must add Hecht often finds the funny side. Say the comic side of being mugged. In a favorite of mine, one which begins with his 12-year-old daughter asking what the word dauntless means in the novel she's reading. Dauntless. Instead of telling her to look it up, he plays smarty pants with her. He says, dauntless means to lack daunt, to be without it, as if that helps. And playing along, she replies, do we have any? He doesn't know. Maybe at the back of the fridge, no, nothing there. But at the end of the poem, being robbed at gunpoint, he finds his daunt, being undaunted and dauntless. Sometimes he asks questions like, what will they do once they catch you? Which makes me wonder, who are they? And why are they looking for you? Hecht is a specialist in enigma. Why do we ignore the extinction of species? Is it so, as he writes, we can ignore our place in the extinction parade? Hecht's project in Witness Report is to report what he's witnessed of just what kind of world we have made. He expands the inquiry, considering the world that we make for the millions of microorganisms that live in us, considering the cellar that the serial killer makes for his murdered boys. What we do, what we've done, and how we come undone, finally, as he ends the poem Sky Burial. If there were any other animal, if I were any other animal, my skin might become shoes, my bones knives, or needles, or buttons, or combs. It is fitting, nothing about me wasted, nothing about me not becoming something else. In Witness Report, Roger Hecht shows us that he becomes words, and that words become poems, and that poems become part of the world they make for us, and show us how it's done. And I give you Roger Hecht, who is something else.
Thank you, Bob. I'm gushing. I'm a little gassy, but I'm gushing. That was wonderful. Thank you. That's quite a lead, not a send off, a lead off, a wonderful introduction. And Bob Benson is a wonderful poet and a wonderful teacher, and he and I have had numerous conversations. He's kind enough to give me little sneak peeks of his workshops at Bright Hill. So if you're in the Oneonta area and can attend those workshops, I strongly encourage you to do so. So this is I hope you like my new pad. I just moved in. It's got a great view, and also I seem to lose things in the course of it. It's a magical landscape of Microsoft Teams. So anyhow, so what I'd like to do is, first of all, thank you everybody for being here. And I would say, I'm looking out at the smiling crowds. You're all very patiently sitting there nicely at home. I hope you have a nice glass of wine, because wine and cheese are required for poetry readings. We could never do that at Craven Lounge, so what a plus for us all. I'm going to read some poems from the book Witness Report. I don't know, can't really see it too well because of the green screen effect, but it is available at your local Green Toad books. No, actually, I never managed to get copies to Green Toad Bookstore. Finishinglinepress.com. We'll put a little link on the website to get you there. But anyhow, this is the title poem, Witness Report. You couldn't tell distress in the duck's face, not from the distance we watched it. Maybe in her gait, or in the rapid turns of her head with the traffic whizzing past. Certainly, the raft of ducklings strung in a line, then rushing in behind her, showed, at the very least, confusion. The duck hopped a granite curb the ducklings couldn't leap. It seemed a storybook tragedy was playing out before us. A man tried herding them to the sidewalk, waving off cars that slowed and fortunately didn't wreck. And when the ducks turned back across the road, we knew the resulting mess would form the stories the dozen of us watching helplessly from the gas station pumps might tell our friends that night, at dinner, or over drinks. We're a sentimental town. But all the lights were with them. A woman lifted duckling after duckling from the blacktop to the grass, where the duck and brood regrouped and could wander safely to their certain deaths sometime off in the future. And so, one by one, we all drive off with a great appreciation of just what kind of world we have made. I think that's my version of traveling through the dark. So we're all traveling. Wow, nice background, Bob. We're all playing. It was fun, but it's just Teams has got all sorts of fun little toys involved in it. I've been teaching online since, you know, the pandemic, the shutdown started, so I'm kind of used to this newfangled thing. I'm very old school. I like paper and people, but we try to have fun with this as well. This is a poem. Garrison Keillor is no longer on the radio, and you know, those people of a certain generation will know exactly who I'm talking about. Those of a different generation who don't listen to PBS or NPR obsessively probably aren't going to catch the name. Garrison Keillor had a radio show called Writer's Almanac, where he would share a bunch of literary trivia, celebrate the birthdays of famous authors, and then read a poem every week. And so, you know, I think there's a way everybody, I think, wants to be one of Garrison Keillor's radio subjects. And yet there's a little, you know, it's hard not to be a little snarky about it too. So I think this is my snarky take. He would always start off his announcements of the birthday announcements is to say, and on this day, so-and-so was born. And then there'd be a little bit of, you know, Emily Dickinson was born, or the inventor of the typewriter was born. So the title of this poem is, And on This Day. And on this day, I will write a poem Garrison Keillor could read on the radio, each word formed around the sound of his voice, lines and pauses aligned to the measure of his Minnesota breath. And let there be S's enough so the whistles through his teeth mirror the wind in the trees where the poem goes. A cabin by a lake in the Adirondacks, perhaps, or the West Virginia hills where your family failed repeatedly to build that summer house. The weekends hacking hopelessly at the undergrowth that regenerated into impenetrable walls, leaving you with only the vague warmth of a flimsy campfire, hot dogs and tea and a dirty flannel shirt. The kind Keillor might sport on Minnesota mornings, chopping firewood or writing scripts, till your parents gave up and bought a condo at the beach. But that doesn't matter, because Keillor's warm accent and the soft Americana piano chords envelop you in nostalgia enough to remind you how you don't live there, never did. And wherever you do live, a ranch or colonial spotting a cul-de-sac somewhere, or a cramped city walk-up where the streetlights and sirens fill the windows all night, is a place to escape. A place to seek refuge there among the maples and pines and small stands of birch, the leaf and needle-strewn shoreline, the lake's rippled surface reflecting and distorting a darkening sky. Too cold to swim now. So you listen to the night settling in, the birds settling down, not too many insects, not much sunlight left. So you wait for evening's last spotlight to pierce the branches in the kitchen window, lined with bottles a century old, dug from old trash heaps half a century ago, when you were the sort of exploring boy you always thought you would be, easing them from the mud, rinsing them from a creek, saving only the best. Bottles with colors they don't make anymore, once filled with mysterious potions they don't make anymore. And the marmalade sunlight filling the kitchen with upended bottle-light rainbows makes the cabin a homespun chart, filled with promise and youth you promised yourself you would always cling to. That's how you remember it, or how you would remember it if you ever had a cabin, or a cabin that wasn't just a voice, just a poem in the voice of Garrison Keillor, whistling and whispering through the radio, mixing with the fade-in of Americana piano, which tinkles to a stop, then news from the latest war. So he had his radio show during the morning edition, so you'd get this lovely little poetic interlude and then more bombs going off someplace else. Bob mentioned a poem about people burying bodies in cellars. So yeah, it's a good one to move into after that lovely pastoral lakeside interlude. This is simply called prose poem. I'm good with titles. I am the bones of the boy buried in the cellar. The boy the cellar was built for. The boy that was here long before there were cellars. I am the bones of the boy, but I am not the boy. I am the bones of the boy in a congress of bones, a body of boys long gone, a body that meets when there is nothing to say and no way to say it and cannot sleep. The bones of the mice, the bones of the cats dragged in, scramble the rafters to invisible nests. Their sinews dissolved. They motion back to dust where they sleep, reassemble and scramble, a different mouse each night. I never sleep, being bones still clinging to their boyhood. The boys call their meetings to order, slap secret handshakes, throw hand signs and fingers into far corners. Each meeting, each presiding officer resigns until the body finally dissolves. Again and again, the motion dies. All of a sudden I realized it's kind of like a faculty meeting. Then the boys and the bones will no longer be present to say here. Let's say the boys lit out for the frontier where there is no grass to trip them up, no roots to tangle their feet the way they entangled me. Roots worm into the cellar, worms root our demise. The boys who once hooked them for fish bait are now meals in the fields where circling birds remind them of universal forms stacked like Legos, logos, the law they could never avoid. The boys unhinge their jaws as if they could be heard. They have no use for words now, no use for limbs, no use for the hands that held them down. What was that about? I don't know. That's rather grim, wasn't it? This is a rather on a different mood. I think this will be fun. I wrote this poem when I was watching the series on Netflix, Borgia, about the Borgia family and Renaissance Renaissance Rome, and you have all sorts of walk-on characters of Machiavelli and Michelangelo and Da Vinci and people like that. So I don't know, this just popped into my head. For those of you who want to know, an orrery, which is the central device of this poem, is a mechanical, it's a mechanical model of the solar system. They were all the rage in the 18th century as astronomy was becoming refined. And somehow I managed to translate. I have this habit. I'll read a couple of poems like this where I'm rewriting history. It's kind of speculative poetry. It's not exactly science fiction, but it's history as if your, drunk grandmother wrote it or something. The ornery orrery. A drunk grandmother with a very strong attentiveness to sound. The ornery orrery. Egad, cried Machiavelli. This orrery is stuck. The planets don't align. Now, how will I predict the rise and fall of kings, the comings and goings of plagues, and on which horse God wills me to place my ducats? Leonardo, with an eye toward the mechanical, squinted at the marvelous machine. Its wheels and gorgeously engraved discs, its metal spheres perched on sticks. He tried its brass gears, tightened and loosened screws, worried the crank. He recognized the problem at once. Fool, he cried, popping the flat-topped cap off the Florentine's head. Don't you see? This machine can't even exist. We live in a geocentric universe. This heliocentric universe won't be confirmed for 150 years. He relabeled the celestial objects, and the truth came perfectly clear. Besides, your dripping candle jammed it here. He flicked a plug of wax off with his knife, turned the crank, and set the future in motion. The wheels turned freely. Planets spun their orbits. Eclipses came and went. Fruits tumbled from their branches. Princes became obsolete while the sun stayed firmly in place. I see, the master statesman murmured, astounded as his world fell to ruin before his eyes like clockwork. Ooh, history changes. Bob mentioned the poem involving gunpoint muggings. I've fortunately never been mugged at gunpoint, so if the experience is different from this, I'm certainly open to correction, so you could put that in the Q&A or something like that. I was mugged, it wasn't anything like that. This is called Sunlight Beckons Beyond the Dumpster. This is a very evocative title. You have to picture a dumpster and sunlight beyond the dumpster. My 12-year-old daughter reading a novel comes across a new word. She asks, what is dauntless? I say, to lack daunt, to be without it, as if that helps. She asks, so, do we have any? I have to say I don't know. No one ever asked, and I wouldn't know where to look. The bookshelf? The back of the fridge? Nothing. So next time I'm downtown and some worn-out guy stretches out a hand, I'll have to shrug, point to my hips and make the empty pocket gesture and say with my face, maybe next time, bro, because you see, I'm dauntless. And I'd walk away embarrassed because maybe that's a lie, and I have some beside the quarters in my car's cup holder that I didn't give to the guy with the sign on the corner near Dunkin' Donuts when I stopped at the light. We're not, because probably I'm dauntless, which is not to say I'm undaunted, since that presumes I once had it, or having lost it, plan to get some more. Getting some? What would I do with it? What would anyone do? Invest it, I guess, but not in a bank, not at these rates. I'd have to find a firm, invest aggressively, take risks, watch my daunt grow, buy up companies, sell off the parts, get at the source, mines, mineral rights, key lanes of transport, workers toiling night and day, mountaintops removed, slick water horizontal drill rigs churning, whole forests leveled and replanted to monocrop daunt, because there's only so much of it, and so much need. And if there isn't need, I'll make it with ads on the Sunday morning talk shows and BuzzFeed pop-ups. So long as I can keep the unions out. Easy enough if I spread some around to the right people. But really, I'm not that ambitious and don't think myself greedy. I just want enough for me. How I get it doesn't matter. Let's just say I met a guy who knows a guy who has a connection and told me where to meet him behind in the alley behind the shore mark. Yes, it costs more than I want, but I don't get to set the price. I meet the man who offers me a taste because that's good business. I can feel my cheeks flush and that pleasant buzzing on my gums. But around the block, there's another two guys waiting, which I should have expected. I don't resist, but I don't show fear. My impulse is to stare at the gun, but I look the guy right in the eye. He's scared too and refuses my gaze. His partner rifles my pockets, shoves me hard against the dumpster. I hold my own, chest out, heart racing, on the verge of tears. It's snowing, maybe, or raining, or maybe the sun is out and a warm breeze is telling me to pull myself out of the shadows and start the day on a firmer foot. But I remain on the greasy bricks, stuck in darkness where I am, fearful and needy, full of remorse, undaunted, and still dauntless. We'll let that one sink in. I'd like to read maybe just two more poems from the collection, and then a couple of newer ones that aren't in any book, but they have been published. Let's see. Bob had mentioned the poem about two poems. I'm going to read this one called Signs, which I believe, if I count the lines up, is a sonnet. Signs. The Romans read entrails to discern the future. We read stools for sign, too much fiber, cancer, foreclosure. The Jews force-fed maggots to Roman goats to buy themselves time in the dust of Masada. We eat kale and cabbage, acai bowl sprinkled with chia seeds, determined to extend our days another day. You'll find us tending our gut flora with the acuity of termites turning a forest to soil. And in the time it's taken to tend these lines, another species has died. A fish, a frog, an insect, unseen by us, who've tried so hard to interpret the signs of the world we've made, ignoring our spot in the extinction parade. Wow, that's dark. Want to get a sense of the time here. So this is called Sky Burial. My poem, my attitude isn't really this dark, but I like to think there's a lightness underneath the darkness, a little bit of hopefulness. A sky burial, for those who do not know, a sky burial is the funerary practice in Tibet, where, on the Tibetan plateau, you're basically living on granite. There's not a whole lot of dirt where you can dig graves. And so the Buddhist practice is to basically bring the deceased to a particular spot on the mountain and leave it there for the vultures, which, may seem really grim, but I always thought it was a kind of a neat gesture, because you're definitely returning, your body's returning to the earth. It's becoming part of the cycle rather than kind of continuing this illusion that we are not part of the cycle of life, in our lead-lined caskets and formaldehyde baths and things like that. So this is my death wish, but it's also my life wish. Sky burial. If only I could see and smell, could keep my senses as I lose them, wouldn't I find it delicious? the enzymes without me, replacing the enzymes within me, replacing cell by cell my body. Such transcendence. Patiently, they're waiting the day my defenses diminish, waiting to transfigure. And while I diminish, I will swell like pride with gases, anticipating my higher function. Protein for the cleansing birds, a nest, my hair, my brain case, shelter for a mouse. If I were any other animal, my skin might become shoes, my bones knives or needles or buttons or combs. It is fitting. Nothing about me wasted, nothing about me not becoming something else. I'll leave the rest of the poems to encourage you, give you a little taste, and you're going to want to buy the book. So that's good marketing. That's don't want to give it all to you for free, because I'm not getting paid for this. I let the cat out of the bag. These are some poems that have been published since the book was accepted. So it's just some examples of new work. This is a poem to kind of go back to that idea of the orrery of rewriting history or re-envisioning history, a big what if. And the title of the poem is called Notable Ego Shortages. And where would somebody come up with a title like that? Actually, a friend of mine emailed it to me. He actually found under, I don't know why he went to Wikipedia to look up Eggos, but there's a Wikipedia entry on Eggos. It makes sense. It's a popular breakfast food. And in the midst of that Wikipedia entry is a subcategory called Notable Ego Shortages. And I have to imagine, what would those be? What would cause a notable ego shortage? So that's the genesis of this poem. So I'm rewriting the history of our breakfast food here. Notable ego shortages, 1898. The hurricane that tore Galveston off the map is better known, but a storm 2 years prior made mincemeat of Puerto Rico, swamped with 8 days of rain. Small egg production from family farms and smuggling routes, rum roads that long predated the charge up San Juan Hill, were decimated. Factory owners scrambled to make new egg networks viable to meet consumer demand, rising vigorously since the introduction of Lego to the nation's vocabulary. By then, the government had commandeered much of the poultry industry to feed its forces readying for war. Only a diversion of troops en route to Cuba prevented food riots in several East Coast cities. 1936. The factory workers had had enough. Their pay was pennies, hours on their feet with few scheduled breaks, barely enough time to pee when they got any relief. They sweated severely in their germ-free suits. It was scorchingly hot on the baking floors. In the cooling rooms, their gloves for handling the waffles were paper thin, no insulation. Some men were even hospitalized with frostbite. Discipline was strict, no talking, even during lunch. Spies were everywhere. The 3 men who conceived of the strike met surprisingly in the open, in the diner across the street. Their code? The number of chews before they swallowed their donuts. Despite the goons, there were networks, ways of getting the word out, the date set. When the shift changed, no one moved. The managers worked in the offices next door. The gates were shut. Overseers shoved out open windows. The plant was theirs. When the police charged the building, workers pelted them with frozen discs that hit their targets with surprising accuracy. Cops were stunned, but no one was hurt. During the stalemate that followed, the workers maintained discipline among themselves, even formed their own government that became a model for aspiring countries years later. The most important rule: no one abuses the product. While they hated management, they loved the waffles. Once during the weekly talent show, some palooka danced a hula wearing nothing but waffles strung together as a bikini. He was seized, tried, summarily convicted by the workers' court, and expelled from the factory, tossed down the chute where the burnt waffles go. The workers cheered then. They cheered even louder when the strike ended 43 days later. The country cheered too, sick of their diet of muesli. 1983. The source of the illness was a mystery. The waffle, the syrup, possibly overripe fruit. Maybe it was simply the flu. But one patient became a dozen became scores. Symptoms all the same: stomach distress, fever. Some were racked with convulsions. When a child died, people panicked. The recall encompassed over 30 states. Factories were shut down, cleaned and inspected, then re-cleaned and re-inspected. Then the extortion notes came. They demanded ransom and public statements, admitting to crimes both preposterous and utterly humiliating. The sample poisons the criminals sent to prove they were the agents of the illness, the agents of the apocalypse they hoped to rain down on the country, proved their intent. Just as mysteriously, the illness is stopped. No one can say for certain if the ransom was paid or the statements were said, since no one ever said. 2021. The country had been in a state of high anxiety for some time, what with trade wars resulting in ground wars and conflicts at home breaking into occasional bursts of violence. People had stopped trusting one another. Many would accept anything as a sign of hope. That an ego should be the medium is not surprising, given the company's place in the nation's psyche. Their slogan, as significant a statement of the people's sense of personal independence, having practically replaced "Ne me traitez pas" as the national motto. The Savior's face first appeared at a breakfast table of a day worker in Grover's Mill on a buttermilk waffle. The scorched impression was so distinct he could not bear to defile it even with syrup, much less a fork and knife. The story would have been easy enough to dismiss had not a retiree in Crystal Springs not found a similar image singed in his buckwheat waffle with a secondhand panini press, something that had never happened on his white or wheat toast. When church officials, after inspecting both toaster and press, confirmed the events, the public run-on egos of all varieties overwhelmed the company. What must first have seemed a miracle, a spike in sales in the middle of a recession, quickly became a curse, with demand quickly outstripping production and small riots erupting at Wegmans stores on both coasts. When the venture capitalists moved in, that's when the venture capitalists moved in, sensing a crisis to exploit. The cash infusion was in fact too good to be true. Yes, production ramped up as waffle plants ran 3 shifts, but with so much new debt, the promised buildup of infrastructure was never in the cards. The first thing the new board sold off was the lucrative egg distribution system, the finest in the country, developed in the wake of the crisis of 1898. The next thing to go, stakes in wheat production, even the warehouse stock to foreign investors planning for the next drought. Bit by bit, the shipping fleets, the cardboard plants, even spare tires were sold to the highest and often the lowest bidder. Aging factories were sold for scrap. The unions, having long ago given up for stock options, were helpless to stop the process. No number of blessed prayer towels could save the company. By then, the faces of Jesus were appearing regularly in pizzas energy bars, sunburns, the peeled back lids of cat food cans, anywhere the citizens' fevered imaginations could put it. The only thing left to sell was the company name, which a collective of artisanal bakers backed with cannabis money snagged at a fire sale price. That we still have egos at all might be the miracle of this story. One responds to the world around them. This poem, this will be the last poem, and then I know we'll have a little Q&A, so we can do that too. And so I hope you have lots of really inspired questions. This poem, I like using found sources, as you can see, like Wikipedia entries and stuff like that. In the age of internet and email and stuff like that, besides the upside of all of those great things we can buy from Amazon, the downside is extortion. I had somebody found a password that I had abandoned decades ago, not decades ago, but some time ago, and was threatening to expose all of my deep, dark pornography viewing habits, and was demanding Bitcoin in response. I have a great file of all the extortion letters I've gotten from very kind of Russian sounding grammatical constructions. So I'm assuming that they're in a file along with the offers from Nigerian princes and like Saudi ministers of finance, to move money in and around the country. I never knew I had such power. So this is called My Extortionist Wants to Woo Me. My extortionist wants to woo me, but I don't think he knows how. All bluster and bravado, his masculine force belies a failing nerve. How many crumpled letters till he could muster the words to say, I know what you've been up to, and all that talk of consequence. I'm fickle, I don't fall fast, I'm old-fashioned. I want him to work for my affections. Each time he fails, I know my extortionist does care for my well-being, the way he writes nearly every day, so deeply concerned for my reputation. His letters sing, I've seen you, I've seen you, I've seen you, and all that I've watched on my computer. He has the pictures to prove it, he says. I imagine them spangling his walls as he conspires again and again to win my heart. I think of him watching me, watching my screen. He thinks I have excellent taste, ha. I like that he likes what I like. I love thinking he thinks my habits are worth his attention, worth enough. He's put a price tag on my love in Bitcoin, and he's willing to tell the world, I just might fall for him yet. Thanks for coming by. This was fun, a little sampling of some of the things I'm up to. It's 8:12, so I think that's probably enough poetry from one night, especially since we've all been staring at screens. So I understand there's a possibility of Q&A, and I'm going to open up my little screen. And how can I be the man when Roger Hecht is the man? I may be a man. I don't know. I don't know how to answer that. I think in some ways we're all the man, or the woman. I don't want to, no gender exclusion at all. So you like my background? I'm noticing it looks like there's a fire in the sort of over my whatever shoulder, my right shoulder there. So I don't know if this is a recent picture of California. I hope that's simply a very large campfire and not out of control. Have I a book in the making? That's a very good question. I was printing off the poems, the loose poems, and I was realizing there is a book in the making. I'm very fortunate. I'm very grateful that I have a sabbatical coming up, and one of my projects you had mentioned, Bob. I'm working on a book on environmental themes in the films of Hayao Miyazaki, Studio Ghibli. And that book's about halfway written. My goal is to finish that or get a full draft done, but also to write poems. And so I'd like to think I would have at least the significant makings toward a book. I don't have that's not true. I have a kind of a side project. I didn't read any of the poems because I don't know if they're necessarily good for the ear. I have a number of poems called liner notes, where my found object, my source text for the liner notes are record album liner notes, vinyl. The trick is the poems are acrostics with the name of the artist and the album title as the vertical text, and then the rest of it is trying to piece together some kind of poem using the text of the liner notes. And I've had fun with it, and I imagine that could be a chapbook. I have a few more of those to write, but as I said, they're not necessarily oral poems. They ricochet around a lot. I don't know if they'd make a lot of sense to the ear. But I would say yes. I have lots of writing projects going on. So, yes, the Q&A. I'm sorry, I just can't point and say, yes, you in the yellow shirt, you look like you're about to ask a question. I can tell from the restless way you're shifting in your seat and packing up your backpack like you're anxious to leave.
Roger, look at the published ones.
Oh, there's 13 of them. Okay, sorry. I thank you, Ruth. So let's see. Who's Jerry? I think whether the poem about the ego virus reads differently for you these days. Actually, both of them read kind of differently. Different aspects of the poem read differently for me because, well, the 83 section of that poem was really a kind of an allusion to the Tylenol poisoning scare when was it arsenic? Somebody was putting arsenic in Tylenol, and that's why we've got all of those layers and layers of plastic and foil and childproof caps to keep us from getting to our medicine. But of course, yeah, pandemic changes the color of that. And also, I was having fun when I wrote the poem, imagining the near future of this sort of, cultural collapse. Not anticipating that we were actually so close to it when I wrote the poem last year. So yeah, where do you find your inspiration from real events in your life? A number of things. I didn't read the poem. There's a number of poems that are probably more pointedly autobiographical that I just didn't particularly want to share right now. A lot of it is language. I will find hear interesting phrases. The orrery, literally, I like the sound of those. Of it's a silly statement, and then lots of wordplay there. And so once I came up with the idea of an orrery, I had to create what the poem itself just kind of followed from that, in the same way that the notable ego shortages just sort of offered you know, just a possibility, you know, hey, what could they possibly be? Some of them, now Witness Report, the first poem I read, really recounts an actual event. I was at the gas station watching ducks try to cross Route 13 in Ithaca, and this sort of, you know, potentially awful thing was going to happen in front of our eyes while a couple of people were trying to, you know, stop traffic and help the ducks get across. And eventually they did. So the ducks hopefully still have, the babies have matured and are now inhabiting the inlet in Ithaca. So some of them I'll admit, I'm being kind of frankly silly. I think there's a silly side to me, like, oh yeah, and also the dauntless. Literally, my daughter did ask me, you know, what is the word dauntless? I forget what novel she was reading at the time, and again, that was a kind of imagining, well, what is dauntless, and just kind of playing around with it. What is your favorite poem out of these, and why? That's a really, I mean, it's a really good question, and it's a really hard question to answer because, you know, every poem comes out of a different circumstance. I think my favorite poem out of all these is Sky Burial. And I don't know if I'm, you know, sort of attracted to that, you know, you have these questions, you know, what do you want to have done? You know, I constantly tell my daughters that they're going to have to haul me up to some kind of mountain and leave me for the vultures. They don't appreciate that too much. But, you know, for me, philosophically, it's a really compelling idea. And I think I borrow a lot from Gary Snyder's poetry, who I admire quite a bit in some of that imagery too. I also like the ones that I play with history. There's another poem, I didn't read it, where I imagine Abraham Lincoln hanging out with Japanese expatriates in New Jersey. And why? I actually had a dream where Abraham Lincoln was hanging out with expatriates, Japanese expatriates, like samurai who left, they saw the empire falling apart and they sought refuge in America, as lots of people sought refuge in America, and kind of imagined Lincoln, you know, reciting Basho and oh yeah, he played the saxophone in that poem as well. So it's just sort of like dreams can be good sources for poetry, and sometimes the outcome is really, really fun. Sometimes the outcome is disastrous too, and I don't read those poems. So did I do research for the ego poem? Not really. I mean, yes and no, in the sense that I kind of I wanted to link the poem to actual events. So there was a hurricane that predated the one that destroyed Galveston. So, but and I think I wrote that poem around the time that Puerto Rico was, you know, under such distress. I lose track of which hurricane has which name, but the one that devastated Puerto Rico a couple of years ago. So I kind of had that in mind, and I wanted to locate it, find an earlier storm that Puerto Rico was severely damaged by. The 1936 section is based on the GM strike, you know, where the workers occupied the GM plant. So there is some kind of actual historical fidelity. It's just egos. And what's funnier than an ego? So Peter asks, when were you first published? My first poems were, I mean, I suppose well, here's a funny story. My first actual publication was when I was 13, and I wrote an article that was published by Lynn's Stamp News. I was a stamp collector, a young philatelist. And I was obsessed with a tiny country called Tanatuva, which is a semi-autonomous republic on the Mongolian-Russian border that produced stamps from 1914 to 1936. This is how trivia really sticks in your head. And I, you just like your kid, you just sort of link in on this thing. So I researched Tanatuva. Probably it's safe to say that most of the article was plagiarized because I was 13 and didn't know better. I know now not to plagiarize. That was my first publication, but my first poems were published in the University of Maryland student-run literary magazine, the Calvert Review. And then subsequently, once I started in the MFA program at University of Arizona, that's when you start sending poems out to literary magazines. And I had poems that were published in a contest, the Journal for a Contest, or Puerto del Sol published, was my first sort of publication that felt like a count, because everybody who was writing poetry knew what Puerto del Sol was. So it's a long history, but there are also long periods of time where nothing gets published. You just send out, and I used to put all of the rejection letters that I would get on my refrigerator. I don't know, Beth, you might remember this. It was just sort of a thing that I did. Everybody was like, you're going to destroy yourself. I thought it was kind of funny. So eventually, for pressure from my friends, I took down all my rejection letters, and so I cut them up into little one-sentence snippets and stuck them in a hat and pulled them out. And I made a found poem with all the lines from my rejection letters, which immediately got published. So funny how that happens. Where do you find your inspiration? Real life ideas just come to you. That's a good question about America. There's a couple of poets who deeply inspire me. Emily Dickinson, who I suppose she could be linked with the she wasn't part of the Transcendentalist circle, but she's in the Transcendentalist period. Gary Snyder, I mentioned, his very sparse, precise imagery inspired by Japanese and Chinese poetics. There's a poet, I think the silliness in my poems comes from a poet named Ron Padgett, who has these wonderful shifts in turns, who he can sort of deal with dark subjects in an incredibly light and funny way. So yeah, I didn't read it. It's in the chapbook. I have a poem that is a sort of a riff on Emily Dickinson's poem. I heard a fly buzz when I died, except I tell it from the fly's point of view, which might be very relevant. Maybe I should have read it given the events of last night's debate. Let's see. So yeah, so I want to see which ones I may have looked at before. Yeah, I do read. I mean, sometimes research goes into my poems. I'll tell you that again, the poem that I didn't read that's about Lincoln and the Japanese delegation that he's hanging out with in New Jersey. I did actually research Japanese instruments. I researched how kimonos looked. I also had to figure, when did Japanese first come to America after Perry opened up the opened the country up in the 1850s, and I learned that there was basically a government delegation who came to Washington. So I imagined some tag-along samurai who decided to stay. Yeah, the world, there's all sorts of great facts in the world. And I suppose since I'm always reading, I'm always researching, and it makes its way into my poems, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not. Is there a connection between poetry and music? Absolutely. I mean, the lyric, if you think about lyrics in songs, well, there's lyric poetry, and I don't know if maybe I tried to emphasize it when I'm reading. There's a lot of rhythm in language and a lot of sound textures in language that I like to play with, and I might not be a metrical poet, in terms of perfectly scanned iams or things like that, but I like to go in and out of strong rhythmic feelings in the poem. So, and I play drums, so that may play a role in it too. I often find myself in the situation where if, like, we're in the kitchen making dinner and my wife starts humming or singing a song, I'll come up with a different song, not because, I think my song's better than my wife's, but the rhythm of the song she's singing matches a rhythm of a different song in my head, and it just kind of triggers. It's really interesting how that works. You noted in your bio blurb that you play drums. How convenient. I didn't see that message that question when I was answering the one above it. So I hope that does. I sort of getting to that. Yeah, I mean, I played guitar when I started. I started playing music probably the way a lot of kids do. School band and stuff like that. Played guitar for a while in high school. I didn't pick up drums until I was 50, so you can actually have like late life transformations. But I always wanted to play drums, so maybe I have an innate sense of rhythm. One of my first writing experiences, like when I decided I think I wanted to be a lyricist before I decided I was going to do poetry. And so when I was in high school, I wrote a rock opera. Probably, I imagine probably lots of people have that rock opera that's in a closet that they'll never show anybody. But it turned out that every song that I wrote matched perfectly something by The Who. It was either from Tommy or Quadrophenia. So it was actually, I didn't think of it in this way, but it was actually a really interesting exercise in imitation. If there's an artist that you like, you imitate their work, you imitate your style, and then eventually it becomes your own and you're doing your own thing. They're terrible lyrics, and I dread the idea of somebody rummaging through those boxes and saying, hey, he wrote something called The Fall of the American Empire in 1979. I guess I sort of wrote music in a way before I was writing poetry, but yeah, they're all tied together. Do I write every day? I really wish I did. I mean, part of it is during the semester, there are so many tasks that we have to do. I know some people that are extremely disciplined. They, and often talk about, you set up, an hour or even 20 minutes every day where you're just like, you sit with your journal and you write. Or even if you sit with your journal and you don't write, you did your part, the poem didn't show up, but at least you're setting the time up. And I'm not that terribly disciplined. For me, it often comes in spurts. So I'll go through a kind of a stretch of writing where I'm doing a lot every day for a period of time, and then other things in life kind of take over. How do I combat writer's block? If you ever find out how to combat it, I would appreciate your letting me know, because there are times where, yeah, I scrawl stuff down and I hate it, and this is sort of the writer's curse, I think. Nothing is good as you want it to be, and so it all feels like garbage. Do you edit your poems yourself, or does somebody else help you? I show a lot of my poems to my wife, and she's a writer as well, so we're constantly showing each other our work. If nothing else, just for assurance, yes, you put ink down on a page, keep going. Or, yeah, that actually sounds really good. I don't have some people have communities of writers where, they're constantly sending work to each other and offering feedback and making suggestions. And I'm not really, I don't really have that, so I guess I do most of my editing myself. But you know, when I show things when I do show things to people, if they make suggestions that I like, you know, I'm very happy to take them. But yeah, having a writers community is, you know, an ideal thing if you can have it, you know, that kind of support. Is Robert McCloskey's Make Way for Ducklings a source text? Wow. I have not read that book in a long time, although I'm very familiar with the bronze statues in the Boston Public Garden. You know, it may be, it could be. I mean, yes, the cop officer, whatever his name, that big fat cop, does stop traffic, and the ducks can cross. Was it Comm Avenue or Beacon Street? I'm not too sure where they're going, if anybody remembers. So it is possible. You never know, you know, things filter up in all sorts of unexpected ways. How do you know you have a poem you want to publish? Is there a feeling you get telling you to do it? That's a really good question. You know, sometimes you knock something off and you're really excited about it, and then you want to send it out right away. I think it was like Ezra Pound who, you know, said, you know, suggested, you know, put it in a drawer and wait for a year and then look at it again. I think most of us are a little more, don't feel like we have the patience to wait for a year for every poem that we write to get it out there. I've had poems where I really, you know, was really excited by it and literally took years to get published. I just had to find the right person, the right editor to like it. And then I've had poems where, you know, oftentimes the process is you put together a packet of 5 or 6 pages of poetry and you send it off. Editors don't want to just look at one poem. And then they take the one that I think is the worst. It's like, why the hell they take that? That was just filler. And then the one that you're feeling really excited about takes years to get published. So it's a very obscure process. Yeah, I guess there's a feeling, there's an excitedness. There's a poem that I had that, you know, I was sending out, it was coming back, and then like maybe a year or two later, I cut it in half. And then when I cut it in half, it got published. So I probably sent it out much too early. And that happens, there's no harm in it. And then of course, if you send something out prematurely and it gets taken, there's nothing stopping you from changing it afterwards too. If you thought, oh, I shouldn't have sent that out, but you know, it's out there. So when it goes into the book, you revise it. Do you prefer paper or pen? Good question. I have a notebook. I'm wondering if I have it here. It's just one of those, like those composition books. You get them for like 99 cents at Staples. And little sewn composition book. For me, that's the perfect writing vehicle, you know, because it's handy to carry around. You know, you just whip it out of your backpack when you need to write, and it's not too bulky. I mean, I do compose on the computer sometimes, you know, because it's ready to hand. But I like, you know, I like having something in my hand. There's something about the process of like your thought going through your arm to your fingers and then writing it down. It slows you down a little bit, you know, and I think that action is good, you know. Also, it's like I'm a sloppy typer, and then I'm often, if I'm typing as fast as I'm thinking, I'm always going back and making corrections anyhow. So I don't know. I learned to write before there were computers, or before they were. I didn't learn to use a computer until 1990. So my old process would be to write a poem by hand, go to my IBM Model C typewriter, this giant metal thing you could kill somebody with. You know, type up the poem, pull it out of the typewriter, go to my kitchen table, make corrections, make revisions, go back. It was a very physical process, and it could be really invigorating to go back and forth between the typing table and the kitchen table and back and forth. And I don't know, it's it's easier to do it on the computer, and you can move words around and stuff like that, but I miss that physicality of it. And I guess that's the last question. So it's, wow, we've been here for an hour now. So thank you. These are great questions. I hope the answers were matched the questions well enough. But thank you, everybody, for coming out. This has been wonderful. This is sort of our inaugural online event. I feel so modern now. Thank you, Ruth, for going through basically learning how to do this, so we don't have to learn how to do this, but we should have figured it out because we're adults too. That's important. If without Ruth, our department would just simply fall to shreds. So never retire, please. But everybody else, I don't, thank you for coming. Go get yourselves some nice, have dinner if you haven't eaten it. Go have a beer if you're legal. Have yourself a nice lemonade if you're not. And some of you, I'll see you in class on Tuesday.